What does Ron Launius do? He tracks them down, finds them, kills all of them, saves Susan, brings her back across the border to California, proceeds to locate and hunt down all of those Mexican cartel members, associates, and kills all of them too. Word goes out. This guy is a really bad dude. Do not mess with him.
In this new episode, we speak with author Eli Frankel about the Wonderland Murders. And no, you haven't clicked on an episode you've heard already. This is part 2. Eli joins us again to take us through this story and really expand what we talked about in the first time. What'd you think of this conversation, Lance?
I thought it was a necessary conversation because we had spoken to Eli, like you said, this is part 2. He gave us the surface level introduction to the Wonderland Murders, which took place in Hollywood in 1981 on July 1st, and those who suffered the fate of the Wonderland Murders, Ron Launius, Billy Deverell, David Lynn, Tracy McCourt, Joy Miller, and Susan Launius, who was injured, severely injured in this attack. He takes us through that on a surface level in part 1, and he gets even deeper into it in part 2. There are these characters that he really digs into, really explores, Eddie Nash being the primary topic that we discussed today. Just this dichotomy between him being a businessman and him being a ruthless, freebasing, drugged out of his mind criminal. And the story of Ron Launius, one of the most notorious people involved in this, who was brutal and despicable and extremely dangerous in his own right. But Tim, were you as riveted as I was?
I sure was. Yeah, this story is absolutely wild, and Eli just takes us through this complicated situation expertly. I want to mention that Eli Frankel wrote a book called Sisters in Death, The Black Dahlia, The Prairie Heiress, and Their Hunter. And that book is out in October 28th of 2025. So if you're listening to this before that date, it's not even out yet. And I don't think we talk about the book in this conversation with Eli, but we've had 2 previous ones where we do speak about it. And this book is really excellent.
And if you want to learn more about that book, you can go to sistersindeath.com and learn more about the book. You can learn more on where to buy it. And also, we're going to be doing a live show with Eli at the end of October as well. I believe it's on the 27th, the day before the book is released. So this will be your opportunity to ask him questions about the topic of the Black Dahlia or even the topic of the Wonderland Murders. The guy is a wealth of information, and we're really kind of humbled to have him be a new friend of the show.
Absolutely.
And also his daughter makes a cameo appearance at the end of the episode. It's kind of a funny, lighthearted moment. We decided to keep it in the episode with Eli's permission. It's real quick, but it's a really sort of lighten the mood type moment. So highly recommend listening right to the end on this one.
All right. Well, please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. We're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with Eli Frankel.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome back to the podcast, Eli Frankel. Eli, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you guys doing?
We're doing really well. It's going to be another great conversation that we're about to embark on. I say a conversation, but what I really mean is an education. You have come on a couple of times and really educated us on the Black Dahlia. You've recently educated us on this Wonderland Murders case that was kind of on our peripheral for a while, but really we didn't know much about it, and we were absolutely riveted at the end of that. And during that conversation, you kept saying, I got so much more about this detail, so we decided this is going to have to be a multi-part series. But for anyone who hasn't listened to the part 1, please go back and listen to part 1 on the Wonderland Murders. It was just released a couple of weeks ago, and it's episode 569, I believe. So before we get to that, though, let's have you reintroduce yourself to the listeners.
Yeah, no worries. My name is Eli Frankel. I live in Los Angeles, California. I've been a television and documentary producer for, 25 years now. It's crazy, quarter of a century. And I have a book coming out on October 28th about the Black Dahlia murder, very famous unsolved murder, called Sisters in Death, the Black Dahlia, the Prairie Heiress, and their hunter. That's being released by Kensington Citadel on October 28th. Hopefully some of you will be interested in taking a look at that.
Well, I'm sure our audience will be. And you also joined us recently, as Lance mentioned, to speak about these Wonderland murders. And this is a really complicated story. It seems like there are a lot of avenues to this, and you went through it so expertly last time. There was some that you had to cast aside temporarily just to get to the part where we broke. So we'd like to ask you to go into some of the other parts of this story that you hadn't really gone into in our first conversation.
I'm looking forward to this. One of the interesting kind of approaches we can use here is sort of Wonderland Murders, the deep dive. There's so many podcasts. There was a terrific documentary series that came out last year on Epix MGM about the murders. There's been books written about it by the original detectives and others. There's so much information out there about the case. I thought and I know you guys are thinking this as well, rather than going into the rest of the details of what happened in July of 1981, which, can be easily found in a number of different places, it might be cool to explore some of the unexplored avenues of the case that are equally fascinating to me, at least. And some of the areas that are just rarely mentioned, it requires quite a bit of research and deep digging. I thought it might be fun to kind of go through some of the more salacious and interesting behind the scenes aspects of the story. I'm guessing a lot of people probably haven't heard yet.
I've been ready for this since we hit stop on our last recording.
Okay, I love it. Me too.
Take us back to the 80s in LA.
Yeah. What a time. A truly magical time. It's gritty, it's dangerous, but anything is possible, and culture is exploding across the city. It's going to end up having this massive influence across the world. So super interesting time. But I thought we'd go back actually as kind of an entry point into understanding the, sort of the nemesis of this whole story, Eddie Nash, a guy who on the last podcast I described as being likely the most interesting individual I've ever come across in the history of Los Angeles, which is saying a lot because I'm obsessed with LA and LA true crime history. And there's a lot of pretty fascinating characters. Eddie Nash for me, is at the top of that list. One of the entry points for him as an individual that I think is kind of interesting is there is a little remembered scandal that occurred in the Hollywood Detectives Division of the LAPD in 1970. What happened was that there was a group of detectives. The Hollywood Division is really elite. The Hollywood detectives are sort of a cut above, and they're highly respected. There's a lot of, obviously, very high-profile crime that takes place and has taken place in Hollywood. And these are the guys that are sent in to tackle that. In 1970, there was a huge scandal that exploded in LAPD and Hollywood Division. A band of detectives who had kind of grouped together to supplement their income, if you will. Their scam was they were committing what were called 510s, where they would essentially add on or take away information into the reports on people who had been arrested. So if you got arrested for, let's say, drug smuggling, they could either add even more charges and evidence that suddenly appeared, or they could make the evidence that appeared in your report kind of disappear. And it obviously all depended on how much you were willing to pay them. And in addition, these guys were going around and they would do stuff like throw a brick or shoot a bullet through a business's window late at night. And then obviously that business owner, the alarms would go off. They would call the police, and the detectives would show up, and they would go through that particular business and then steal a bunch of stuff in there, like break into safes, steal goods, whatever it is, and then give them defenses who would then sell them on the black market. So it's really corrupt. LAPD finds out about it, and those detectives are all let go. What's interesting about this is that what was happening in 1969 in Los Angeles, there was a real big murder investigation because of the Tate LaBianca murders, the Manson murders. And Hollywood Division handled the Los Feliz murders of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. And one of the kind of really famous aspects of the investigation was that the detectives who were handling the LaBianca investigation were not cooperating with the detectives who were investigating the Tate murders over in Beverly Hills. There was just no cooperation there. And Vincent Bugliosi, in his infamous, famous book, Helter Skelter, talks about how much difficulty he had with those detectives in getting evidence and working with the district attorney's office and working with other divisions and detectives. It was just stonewalled, and they never figured out until later on that the series of murders were committed by the same people. And a lot of that is owed to this scandal that later blows up in 1970, is that these guys were on the take and they weren't really that interested in engaging in real cooperation with other divisions and investigating these famous murders. Now, the reason I bring up this scandal is that one of the guys who was paying off those detectives and was involved in their corruption was Eddie Nash, who owned a lot of the clubs that were in Hollywood. And he was famous for taking care of cops and detectives. You know, everything was always on the house, whether you went to one of his strip clubs, one of his restaurants, his nightclubs. Eddie took care of the cops. He took care of detectives. It was kind of a two-way street. When Eddie got into trouble, evidence would disappear. His reports just got real hazy. They weren't sure about really what had happened. So, you know, it's just interesting that Eddie Nash is, you know, sort of tied into this scandal that ended up really affecting the Manson investigation. And once again, it's a little breadcrumb into the life of Eddie Nash, who keeps showing up, and his businesses as well. He really was cutting edge in a lot of ways, but of course that's balanced with and we have to take into account all of the criminal activity and the bad stuff he was doing as well. So let's jump into Nash a little bit. I think I kind of touched on him a little bit, sort of to understand who he was and what his history was. And then more importantly, what was he really doing behind the scenes of his clubs, in his home, in his criminal networks? Who is he connected with? Rather than just saying he's a drug kingpin living in a home who was burglarized or robbed by the Wonderland gang and got his revenge. Well, like, what's the behind the scenes story? Who is this guy? How big was he really? And that helps us set in the context what the Wonderland gang did and how risky it was. To understand that, we have to understand who Eddie Nash was. So, as I think I mentioned last time, he's born Abdel Garib Nasrallah. He's born in what is then British mandated Palestine in 1929, and then he's a Christian Palestinian. He came from a middle class family, and then when the state of Israel is formed in 1948. He flees Palestine. He moves to Las Vegas, opens a bar, gets married, but eventually is interested in acting. And so he moves to Los Angeles and gets a bunch of small film roles and kind of cheap TV westerns. One of the characters he plays is a guy named Eddie Nash. And so he likes the name and changes his name to Eddie Nash. He wants to assimilate into America a little more. So he feels that having an Americanized name is going to be better for him. Then, of course, famously opens up a hot dog stand on Hollywood Boulevard, which soon turns into restaurant after club after nightclub to strip club. I mean, the guy ends up owning a lot of properties. And one of the things that I think people don't realize is that not only did he own these clubs, he also bought the land that they sat on. And some of these properties were in incredible locations that he bought at a time when they weren't that expensive. He owned an extremely valuable piece of real estate at the corner of Hollywood Boulevard and Highland, which anyone who's been to Los Angeles knows is, the intersection in Hollywood. And he actually held on to that investment until well after the year 2000. You're talking about a really brilliant businessman. He makes such smart investment choices, but at the same time, he's also getting involved in arson, mail fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. He's fencing stolen property. Of course, he's involved in drug distribution and lots of drugs. Cocaine, heroin, quaaludes, opium. He's just moving a lot of drugs. And the perfect venue to sell them at is at all his establishments, right? It's his private property. Nobody can shut him down. And he's got a customer base. They know where to find him and they know where to find drugs. So he's making money both from legitimate and illegitimate sources. And one of those illegitimate sources is setting his own properties on fire. He's committing arson for profit. So when a business was done for Eddie Nash, sales were down, the customer base is moving on, or the city is ordering him to close the business, which happened a few times, Nash, with his co-conspirators, would burn his own buildings and then collect the insurance payment. He literally would make money when a business was being closed. And he worked with an insurance broker and a well-established insurance adjuster, as well as a guy named Khalil Charlie Khalaf, who was the owner of a Los Angeles restaurant. He was originally from Ramallah in the West Bank in Palestine, and hooked up with Nash in California. And this arson continued, well after the Wonderland murders. There was a really famous teen club, no alcohol, that Nash owned on Beverly Boulevard across from the famous Beverly Center Mall in the heart of Los Angeles, called the Odyssey. And this was a dance club for kids 18 plus. And it was, a place for kids to hang out and have fun. It also was a place where there was an enormous amount of drugs available, and kids would show up and would easily find drugs there and would go out of their mind and would be outside throwing up or having sex or, screaming or whatever. The neighborhood hated the Odyssey and campaigned to get it closed. And so eventually the city demanded it shut down. Well, a few days later, it mysteriously burns down, and that led to an investigation. It was no mystery to the police how this happened. So, they ended up in court cases and charges. It was a lot of, at a time when Nash was under really heavy investigation for the Wonderland murders. So even in 1985, 4 years after the murders, he's just, it's business as usual for him. The Odyssey, again, it's this confluence of positive and negative. The Odyssey is really a legendary club. It was one of the first LGBT-friendly clubs for kids, essentially. And a lot of people found a home there that they couldn't find anywhere else. It also kind of ushered in the new wave revolution, new wave music, really influential place. And I think in a lot of ways, it would have had a more profound impact on the history of LA pop culture if it hadn't been owned by Eddie Nash. Whatever Nash got involved with, later on in history, his name just totally dominates. So, if you look a little deeper, it's like, okay, even the Odyssey, this kids club, was really groundbreaking and revolutionary for its time. But of course, we don't recognize that because it's owned by Eddie Nash and it was burned down by Eddie Nash. When Nash started out in the late 1950s, by the mid 60s, he was kind of on his way and already started owning some clubs. One of his partners was a guy named Hal Glickman, who was a bail bondsman. And the other was a club owner named Dominic Lucci, who was mob connected from out east, right? He had mafia connections. Hal was essentially the longtime investor in Nash's clubs. He owned a restaurant called the King's Arms in Burbank, which was essentially a fancier version of Red Lobster or Sizzler. It's like a buffet restaurant. He wore tracksuits, had huge gold chains, and he had a toupee, black toupee. So he's one of those kind of guys, and was a criminal as well. He bought a gold brick off of somebody for $2,500. It turned out to be fake. The guy wouldn't give him back his money, so Hal and a couple associates kidnapped him and threatened to kill him. The police got involved in that one. These are, pretty rough guys here. He had a wife named Dottie Glickman. She was married to the bail bondsman, Hal Glickman. And when Hal was in prison, remember, this is Eddie Nash's partner. He's an investor. He's given Nash money to set up all these businesses. Hal Glickman has a wife named Dottie Glickman who becomes pretty close with Eddie Nash. And when Hal Glickman is in prison, Nash ends up having an affair with her and also gets her addicted to cocaine. And Dottie Glickman's an interesting character in the whole Wonderland murder saga because after the murders occurred, the killers took off in their car, but they told John Holmes, who was involved, the porn star who was brought into the murders, that he had to walk home. And at this point, Holmes was covered in blood, right? He had been involved in these murders. There'd been an absolute slaughter in that house. He has blood caked all over his clothes, his skin, his face. It's matted in his hair. And he was forced to walk down Laurel Canyon to Ventura Boulevard, hook a right, and he goes to Dupar's Diner, where he drops a couple coins in the payphone to get a ride back to his home and back to his wife in Glendale. But he doesn't call his wife. He calls Dottie Glickman, Hal Glickman's wife. She shows up, picks him up, and drives him to his home in Glendale. And later on, his wife, Sharon, describes that night. He walks into the house, and he's absolutely covered in blood. She can't believe it. He says he got in some trouble. His wife thinks he got beat up by somebody. She's a nurse, so she's got all her, gauze and stuff, and she starts cleaning him off. And as she's cleaning all the blood off, she realizes there's no bruises on his body. There's not even cuts. And she says to him, John, this isn't your blood. And then at that point, he has to explain what happened. And she would later report some of what he said. So imagine Dottie Glickman gets a call at 5 a.m., come pick me up, I'm covered in blood, and she does it.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
I got a quick question about Eddie Nash. You said that he got married, and then we go into all of his clubs and all of the things that he would do, and good and bad and all of that. Did he remain married, or did he get a divorce?
He divorced that woman who was in Vegas and then remarried a different woman later on around 1970, 1971. He got married to Gina Nash. They had 2 kids together. But by 1981, she had left him as his drug use increased, and that I think the house and Donna Lola in Studio City just became more and more of kind of a haven for bad elements. She wanted to protect her kids. She got out of there. And in fact, Nash was stalking her and threatened to kill her. She was staying at her parents' home. I think it was Northern California, pretty far away from Los Angeles. She had to get a restraining order against him. What's interesting is they actually reconnected later on. And I'll get into this in just a bit, but Nash ends up really reconnecting with his family and becoming a pretty amazing family man. Doting grandfather. A lot of what happens in 81, I believe, is owed to drugs. I think it really rotted his brain. And I would guess that his ex-wife, or his wife at the time, probably recognized that, which is why they were able to get back together. The other partner that he has early on that really helps kind of set up this empire is this guy, Dominic Lucci, who owned a lot of clubs and bought a club on Santa Monica Boulevard called PJ's that would later become the Starwood, a very famous club, very important in the history of rock and roll. So one of the early acts that performed at PJ's when Dominic Lucci and Eddie Nash owned it was a guy by the name of Bobby Fuller, who sang the song and had a huge hit, and I Fought the Law and the Law Won. Remember that song? Months before he ends up being murdered, he's becoming this really big singer. And he's got like a number 7 or number 8 song in the charts. But he'd been performing at PJ's, and he also had started dating a waitress there by the name of Melody. Well, Melody also happened to be or had been dating Dominic Lucci. And so this is allegedly, Fuller ends up murdered, and there's a lot of theories as to who killed him. But behind the scenes, a lot of people who were around at the time claimed that Lucci had sent some of his goons to work Fuller over. He was assaulted in his car outside his apartment, and that Fuller, who was a pretty tough guy himself, ended up fighting back, and it just got out of hand, and they killed him. It is very possible that Nash and or his partner Dominic Lucci were responsible for Fuller's death. Just like clockwork in 1981, when the Starwood, which, by the way, launched the Go-Go's, Kool and the Gang, Van Halen, Quiet Riot, huge bands of the 80s and the late 70s, started because Nash and Lucci gave them a chance at the Starwood. But the city forces them to shut down because the place is out of control. Once again, the drug use, bizarre things happening in the parking lot, screaming, it's just an absolutely wild scene. The neighborhood is aghast. And finally, the city forces them to shut down. Guess what happens to the Starwood right after it's forced to shut down? It mysteriously catches on fire. So once again, we see this kind of arson for profit coming in. It's a pretty big part of his business strategy. And again, it's like, Jesus, you just, for the last 8 years, you've been running one of the most influential rock clubs in American history, which is amazing. And what an accomplishment. Look who he launched. But at the same time, he's burning down his own clubs. It's the incredible business person and then the incredible criminal rolled in together. It's such a contradiction, but that's who he was. So in terms of what Nash was involved in and what kind of criminal he was, by 1981, just to set the stakes here, Eddie Nash essentially ran one of LA's largest organized crime networks. He was very powerful, very wealthy, was selling drugs across the city, and was involved in stolen goods, in fencing stolen goods. There's all kinds of criminal activity he was involved in. He was connected, though, to lots of other criminal networks which worked together at the time, piecemeal, on crimes that they would commit together, kind of bringing in specialists. He had very deep connections with the Armenian mafia, Palestinians, the Israeli mob, the Los Angeles Italian mafia, and mafia elements from the East Coast and the Midwest. So, he's criminally connected to all these criminal organizations. So these are networks that are really working together, and they're very effective. And it's interesting, a lot of the people that Nash worked with and knew also worked with the Wonderland gang, with Ron Launius and all of those folks who would be murdered brutally in the Four on the Floor murders on July 1st, 1981. So, for instance, one of Nash's associates was a pretty infamous guy named Horace Big Mac McKenna, who was a 6'6", 300-pound bodybuilder, just an absolute brick of a man. He was a former California Highway Patrol officer, CHIPS. He was a CHIP. And with his former CHIP partner, Mike Woods, ended up creating this strip club empire across the city. And he was also an associate of Ron Launius, who was the head of the Wonderland gang. Launius had actually met him in prison in the late 70s, so they had a relationship that went pretty deep. Through their strip club empire, there was a lot of drugs running through there as well. And he worked with Nash, so those guys were connected, and Launius was connected to him as well. He was actually murdered in 1989. While he was being chauffeured home to his exotic mansion in Brea, California, where he had a menagerie of animals and cages, including a tiger. He was machine gunned by a contract killer hired by his business partner, Mike Woods. So, dramatic lives. Another guy that Nash worked with was named Amnon Baksahan, who was the leader of the Israeli mafia in LA, or one of the leaders of the Israeli mafia. He was actually partying with Eddie Nash the night of Nash's arrest by the cops on July 10th. This guy is, super interesting dude. He ends up moving to Miami in the 1980s. And just to give you a sense of how bold he was, he hired earth-moving equipment. He was in construction. He hired earth-moving equipment to illegally break into Dade County land and steal tons of dirt for his construction projects, which of course he got caught. But these guys were pretty bold criminals. Another guy that Nash worked with was one of the Armenian mob organizations. I won't go into his name, but he and his brother were involved in extortion, drug smuggling, porn, tax fraud, murder, illegal fuel sales. And there were rumors that those guys may have accompanied the Greg Dials and his brother Samuel on the night of the murders. We're pretty certain Greg and Samuel were the ones who committed the murders, but there were at least two other people present in addition to John Holmes. And from this organized crime network, we have a pretty good sense of who else was there, especially from reports of a woman who was actually present at the house that night who identified them. And Nash also had connections and was, had guys on the payroll who worked for law enforcement. Like, for instance, a guy named Henry Hoskins, who was in the ATF and a federal organized crime task force member. This is a federal, law enforcement official. He was an associate of Nash's. He was paid off by Nash and was involved in a lot of his criminal activity. Another guy, Judge Everett Ricks, was someone who Nash paid off not only with cash, but with cocaine. He was a coke addict, and he also served as a judge on one of Nash's trials, which miraculously, Nash got off pretty light on. And one of the reasons is that the judge was, getting his coke fix from Nash. So, he's in pretty deep. And by the way, in a later trial in 1990, when he was tried again, Nash paid off a juror $50,000. And so the jury was deadlocked 11-1. I mean, this guy was Teflon. He could get out of anything. And then in 2000, he was finally arrested for RICO violations. He plea bargained. He admitted to some of what happened in the Wonderland murders. He admitted that he ordered his men to go retrieve stolen goods that were taken from him. And it is possible in the execution of that retrieval of stolen goods that murder may have occurred, meaning I didn't tell them to murder them, but everyone was so pissed off it might have just randomly happened. So he got a short prison sentence and was released. He did plead guilty to racketeering and money laundering in addition to that. This guy he's so successful, and he keeps creating these groundbreaking clubs and making moves in LA that are really impressive. But at the same time, he's also developing a look and a style that is unforgettable. He's flashy. And he's arrogant, he's incredibly dismissive of prison, prosecution, charges. When he's dragged into court, he acts like, he's going to the DMV. It's just a total distraction for him. When he was in court, literally for murder charges, right? He would fall asleep. He would wave to the jury, hello. He was almost daring people to do anything. And the way he walked, the way he dressed, his demeanor, he's part corporate CEO and part criminal kingpin. Literally, like you watch him and you could see him being, the head of a major corporation and also the head of a major organized crime organization. What makes it even more kind of astonishing is that throughout the peak of his power and his influence and this huge sprawling criminal and legitimate business empire, he's also completely addicted to freebasing. And so the guy's out of his mind and yet still managing and running all of these different businesses, which is pretty incredible. And I think that it kind of begs the question, what would have happened if he hadn't turned to crime, if he hadn't gotten associated with bad guys? He was a family man. He was a really good, devoted dad, a really devoted grandfather eventually. And he loved his wife, but, she left him. The drugs got out of control, as I said before. Later on in life, he really kept a low profile. He wasn't involved in anything illegal, just seemed to be, a doting family man. It's really interesting to see that contrast with who he was before. And again, I think drugs plays a big part of that. He had so much money and so much power, came from so little. And then you add in the craziness of Los Angeles in the 1970s and early 80s where everything and anything is available. All these people desperate for his attention, for his money, for his drugs. And the power gets to his head and, he had a few bad years, apparently.
And it's remarkable to me that he actually lives until he's 85 years old. Did he ever stop doing drugs?
Listen, I don't know what the inside story is from his family, but to me, it seems pretty clear by the late 80s, maybe even the mid 80s, he had broken free of the grip of freebase. And I don't think he would have survived much longer if he had actually stayed on it. He did have health problems starting, I think, in his late 60s or early 70s when he was maybe 70 or 71 years old. So at some point in the late 90s, he started having health problems. And I think that's probably what affected the plea deal he made with authorities in 2000, 2001. He served a little bit of prison time. They let him out. And he was a model citizen after that. He lived in an apartment in the Valley. And again, just, his life seemed to be his family. He held on to those really valuable properties and really up and close to the end of his life. The guy owned some of the most desirable real estate in Los Angeles because he bought it when it was cheap. He established his clubs in heavily traffic areas. He found buildings that were for cheap, but were going to get a lot of foot traffic. He did it the right way until he didn't.
Did he cash in when he sold the properties near Hollywood and Highland?
Who knows if he had debt. He certainly didn't live the life of a rich person later on. Who knows? Maybe, he gave the proceeds to his family or he lived off the proceeds. But yeah, there was a significant building that he sold, I think around 2010, maybe a little earlier on Hollywood that is like, everybody in LA has walked by it.
And does his name still resonate out there? Do people still talk about him in a good light or a bad light?
Well, it's never really a good light. Again, it's like everything comes back to Wonderland and Four on the Floor. And yes, that obviously is the headline of his life. But, I think there's a more layered story there. And I think the guy achieved extraordinary accomplishments and was involved in some horrible things and made terrible decisions. And I do think that drugs was greatly to blame for that. Now, he's the one who chose to do the drugs, so it ultimately lies with him. Maybe it's controversial to say, but I think he is a really important business figure in the history of LA. I'm always thinking about okay, do we accept the two-dimensional explanation of somebody is and say, okay, this is the bad guy, say goodnight to the bad guy? Or is there more to the story? Who is he? What did he accomplish? What did he do later on in life? There's a lot more to the story once you begin looking underneath the surface.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about the investigation? Was that difficult for law enforcement to figure out?
Two of the detectives who were on the case, Bob Sousa and Tom Lang, really seasoned, great detectives from downtown, homicide special detectives from Metropolitan. Tom Lang was later infamously involved in the O.J. Simpson case, highly accomplished. There was a real problem, though, in closing these cases. First of all, Nash was, infamously, as I stated before, known for payoffs and was, actively seeking people he could pay off that would allow for his freedom. There just wasn't a lot of people talking. David Lind, who was a member of the Wonderland gang, was a really important source, but even he was kind of antagonistic towards the cops. You're talking about a group of people who are really violent, really rough, don't trust the cops at all, and also are scared of being killed themselves, which they should have been. John Holmes did not cooperate. He knew that Nash would have him killed, find a way to do it if he talked, and so he'd rather stay alive and in prison if he had to than to die quickly ratting out Nash. So it was an excellent investigation, and I would challenge anybody that claims it wasn't. There just was scant help they got from those who were involved. Everybody pretty much kept their mouths shut. And Nash also, had the money to pay for really high-powered lawyers who did an excellent job of defending him. And the trials continued and continued and continued. And eventually in 2000, they sort of got him. But enough time had gone by where, everybody agreed to, short prison sentence and let him go. I think the investigation was handled really well. It's just that it was a tough one.
And can you tell us about the victims of the Wonderland murders?
I'll start with the lead victim, though it's hard to call him a victim considering who he was, but Ron Launius, who was the head of the Wonderland gang, a really violent, vicious individual. He's born in 1944 in Shawneetown, Illinois, growing up in the Sacramento area, the capital of California, in Northern California. In 1962, he joins the Air Force and serves in Vietnam. But in 1971, 1972, he is caught, get this, smuggling heroin in the bodies of soldiers who had been killed in Vietnam and been bagged up and were being sent back to the United States for burial. Ron would place heroin either in within the bodies, and again, I don't know if that means literally within or underneath the clothing, or just in the bags. But apparently, he was smuggling heroin with the soldiers who had died in the war, and eventually the Air Force finds out, and he is obviously honorably discharged in 1972. It's a pretty disgusting thing to do. So he moves to the Sacramento area, where he eventually right away gets involved with robbery, burglary, an intense amount of drug smuggling, and rumors of contract killings. That's never been established, but there's always been these rumors that he was a contract killer hired to kill people. If you needed somebody dead, you could pay him and he would take care of it. The Sacramento police called him the worst criminal they ever met. The worst dude. Just stone cold, a bad guy.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And a lot of other people described him as such as well. So in 1973, he's really starting to get his sea legs in criminal activities. And one of the things he does is he buys junked cars, rusted old cars for, pennies on the dollar, and then retools them, refurbishes them, drives them across the border to Mexico, buys a huge amount of heroin and Quaalude pills, fills up the cars with pounds of heroin, and then hires teenagers in Mexico to drive the car back across the border to California. And that's how he starts bringing in really huge amounts of drugs. And he starts, making some really significant connections with the drug trade in Mexico. He marries a woman by the name of Susan Murphy, takes her to Mexico with him on one of his drug runs. And when they're separated, he has to go off and do some business, and she's in the house they rented or they're staying in or whatever. She is taken hostage by a group of cartel members, drug dealers, whatever it is. They send him a message that they're going to kill her if he doesn't give them drugs, money, whatever. What does Ron Launius do? He tracks them down, finds them, kills all of them, saves Susan, brings her back across the border to California, proceeds to locate and hunt down all of those Mexican cartel members, associates, and kills all of them too. Word goes out. This guy is a really bad dude. Do not mess with him. He's essentially Tony Montana, from Scarface. He's the kind of guy that you do not cross. And if you do, he will take revenge at any cost. And he will enjoy it. That's the kind of guy he is. In 1973, he moves to Yuba City, Arizona, where he's involved in quite a bit of drug smuggling from Mexico. He hooks up with a guy named Carol Sherrill. They end up murdering a suspected narc or informant who they had been doing business with named Gary Moore. They burn his truck because it has blood all over it, get rid of it, and eventually the case is cracked. But, they take care of anybody who crosses them. Gone. So in 1974, Ron and a couple of accomplices are busted trying to smuggle heroin and pills across the Mexican border. They all plead guilty. Ron is sentenced to 8 years in federal prison at McNeil Island in Washington State. And he's going to get out in 1978. And he returns to Sacramento in 1978. The first guy he hooks up with is a dude who he spent time with in McNeil Island named David Lynn, member of the Aryan Brotherhood in prison. He was a biker, heroin addict, and also from the Sacramento area. So, these guys are like peas in a pod. They get along great. They end up moving down to Los Angeles where they meet another criminal named Billy Deverell. And Billy had just started dating a woman by the name of Joy Miller, who lived up on Wonderland, as well as a guy named Tracy McCourt, who would end up being the getaway driver during the Wonderland murders. Ron Launius' wife, Susan, he kind of keeps her a bit of a distance from, the gang he's put together. She's in and out, but unfortunately she'll be there the night of the murders. And then the other member, kind of peripheral member who was there and who was killed was Barbara Richardson, who had just started dating David Lynn. She was really young. It's a really tragic murder there. I mean, all of them were, but Billy Deverell's new girlfriend, Joy Miller, who was the first one at the Wonderland house and was this kind of really well-known drug dealer in the Hollywood Hills and on Wonderland and Laurel Canyon and stuff. Everybody loved her. She was friends with celebrities. Like I said, the Chuck Negron from Three Dog Night. She was beloved. She was like a mom to everybody, just the mom that sells you drugs. People didn't pay her. Everyone owed Joy money, but she wasn't good at collecting money. When Billy started dating her, I think maybe he saw a little bit of a mark in her. She was owed a lot of money by a lot of people, and Billy decided it was time to collect. And all of a sudden, all these cool kind of hippie types who had been like, "Oh, I'll get you back next Tuesday, Joy. I'll take care of this at some point. Can I buy more drugs or whatever?" Billy came in and decided it's time to collect, and people did not say no to him. So the tone sort of changed. By the way, Joy Miller, this is interesting, was married to a Beverly Hills lawyer, lived in Beverly Hills in a beautiful house, had 2 kids, the perfect life, and then gets addicted to heroin, ends up delivering drugs in a shiny white Mercedes, and just not good at collecting the money. Really good at selling the drugs and not good at collecting the money. So, and when the Wonderland gang came together, Ron Launius really set the tone. He, like I said, he was a violent guy. He would do anything to get money or to get drugs. And if anybody got in the way of that, he would either kill them or ensure that they didn't walk for a few months. One of the things he was infamous for in underground networks in the late 70s, after he got out of prison in 78, was that he burned a lot of other drug dealers, burglars, and fences. You would give him goods or money or whatever, and he wouldn't pay back his debt. Now, usually in the criminal world, you don't call the cops, you take care of it yourself. which requires violence as well. That's how they take care of it. But with the Wonderland gang, they kind of were daring other criminals to do something about it. First of all, these guys were really, really rough. They owned a ton of guns. They weren't, shy about using them. They had a steel gate built around the outside of their home on Wonderland that you needed special access in order to enter. They had a couple of pit bulls, and they just weren't afraid. They had a lot of drugs. Launius was bringing huge amounts of drugs across the border from Mexico. He had access to drugs, and a lot of people wanted that, obviously. And especially, in times when the town was dry, a lot of times Launius could be counted on to have something that he could sell. But he was, a guy you did business with at your own peril. And so the whole Wonderland gang developed a really bad reputation. And a lot of people really, really started to dislike them in criminal networks and even drug dealers. And what's interesting, and this is where this is where you can see the trouble starting. Launius knew and worked with a lot of the same people that Nash did. So, for instance, Horace McKenna, who I described before, the former California Highway Patrol officer who had a network of strip clubs and got gunned down himself in 1989. He was a Launius associate. There's a lot of criminal activity going through those clubs. There's a lot of stolen goods that are being fenced by these guys. There was a guy named Paul Kelly who was an associate of Launius's as well as Nash's. He threatened to kill Launius and other members of the Wonderland gang at one point, and then to a witness claimed that he was there the night of the murders, and this was only 2 days after the murders, and described some details that had not been publicly announced, but later on would claim during the trials that he was just bragging and knew nothing. But Kelly, worked with Nash and worked with Launius and hated the Wonderland gang. So Kelly's fence, the guy he would bring stolen goods to, who would then sell them, was a guy named Fat Howard Cook, Howard Leslie Cook, or Fat Howard. This is a guy that also works with Eddie Nash, right? Like Nash brings him items. He knows he has a network of people that can go sell it. You get your cut, he gets his cut. On the afternoon of July 1st, just hours before the Wonderland murders, Billy Deverill, who's one of the Wonderland gang and will be murdered several hours later, actually takes the jewelry that was stolen at Nash's house from Nash, during the robbery they committed on June 29th, and takes it to Fat Howard, their fence, to go sell, which is insane because Fat Howard is also a fence for Eddie Nash and is going to recognize that jewelry. And Nash doesn't know who committed, the robbery of his home yet. So these guys are, they're working in not so sharp ways. So that's who you're dealing with here. I thought it might be interesting also to mention that, you watch the footage that the police shot when they arrived at the Wonderland home. They shot what is famously known as the first videotaped crime scene. It's an amazing record of what transpired, what was in that home. And some of the bodies are still there. Most of the bodies are still there when they're shooting this. When you watch the footage and you read about the aftermath, it just seems like these 4 or 5 guys busted into that house and within seconds had just devastated the victims and ran out. But the truth is, and this is sort of cobbled together from statements that Susan Launius later made, Ron Launius' wife, who survived miraculously the murders, and then police reports and investigations, what really happened that night in the house. And what happened was it wasn't as quick as people thought. The neighbors described hearing, it's incredible they didn't call the police, but the neighbors heard over and over again, and I'm quoting here, screams of anguish and pleas for mercy. They heard a woman screaming repeatedly. It went on for a while. And what we're pretty sure happened, what the police surmised, is that David Lind, who had shot Greg Dials during the house robbery of Nash's house 2 days earlier, he claimed that it was accidental, though who knows. But he shot at Greg Dials and it grazed his leg. Dials was furious. This guy's 300 pounds, pretty tough dude. And he's got a claw hammer and or a lead pipe with a striated threaded end and a bicycle grip on the other. This thing is used for destroying, cracking bones. So he goes in there, he means business. And The guy that Dials was looking for in the house was David Lind. He wanted revenge. He wanted to torture him. He wanted a slow and painful death for Lind. But Lind was not there that night. He had slipped out a few hours earlier to go sell and then do drugs in a motel in the valley with a couple of prostitutes. But his girlfriend, Barbara, was still present on the first floor. She was likely the first one killed. When the killers enter the house, they probably killed Ron Launius fairly quickly. He was probably one of the first to go. They kill the women in the house. They believe they've killed Susan Launius, but she actually survives. They then find Billy Deverell, who, had been running with Launius for a couple of years. I described him earlier. And apparently worked him over really, really badly, trying to get information as to where Lind was. Dials was so worked up and in such a rage, and probably on drugs, he wanted Lind for himself, and he wanted to take care of him, but Lind wasn't there. And so they essentially, whether it's torture or not, they beat the hell out of Billy Deverell without killing him for a while. Which probably accounts for the screams of anguish and pleas for mercy that the neighbors heard until they probably decided he actually doesn't know where Lind is. And then they proceeded to cave his skull in, along with everybody else. So it's a horrible, horrible scene, and probably far worse than what we would initially conceive of when we look at the footage and start reading about this. I think it's kind of an interesting aspect of this.
The footage is not for the faint of heart. Even the pictures are not for the faint of heart.
There were a few detectives who were involved in the investigation who had also been involved in the Manson family murders investigation. And they claimed that Wonderland, 4 on the Floor, was worse. There was more blood. It was more brutal. It was more gruesome. It was more graphic. So that gives you a sense of how bad this was. The detectives were shocked. Detectives who had been there investigating Tate and LaBianca, had been in the homes right after the murders, claimed that this was worse.
Something that came up when looking into this is Liberace. How is he tied into this?
Liberace, famous Liberace, behind the candelabra. There's a lot of information out there. For many years, his lover, his boyfriend, was a guy named Scott Thorson. Pretty shady dude, drug user. His relationship with Lee Liberace had really deteriorated by 1980, 1981. It was pretty combative, to say the least. Right before that point, Thorson is getting more and more addicted to cocaine and freebasing, all kinds of drugs. He's spending time in Vegas with Liberace, but Liberace's sort of moving on. And so Thorson's spending more time in Los Angeles. And one of the reasons is he's connected to Eddie Nash. And he loves going to Nash's house in Studio City and hanging out and doing drugs and talking to people and telling stories. You can see why Nash would have loved having him around. Thorson is a big personality. You watch footage of him. He's a super interesting, fun guy. And, he's Liberace's, lover. He's been there for years. There's a certain Hollywood glamour to having him around. He also ends up giving Nash, extremely expensive Rolls-Royce cars and stuff that Liberace had given him in order to pay for the drugs. So I'm not sure he realizes that Nash is, bleeding him dry as well. But Thorson is hanging out all the time there, and more becomes that guy that, owes them money, and pressure starts coming on, and then threats. And so around the time of the Wonderland murders, Thorson's relationship with Nash is turning dark. Thorson is there, apparently, the day that Nash found John Holmes, suspecting that he was the one who had tipped off the Wonderland gang and had set up the robbery. Thorson is there, and he sees Greg Dials drag Holmes out of his car and into the house, where they tie him up and beat the hell out of him, take out his address book, and threaten to kill everybody he knows, all his family members. Thorson is there, and he said it was absolutely horrifying. And he ends up testifying in 1990 at the trial, which should have convicted Nash, but that was the trial where Nash had paid $50K to pay off a juror. Thorson took a really big risk in testifying against Nash. He could have been killed. And one suspects that there was a lot more that went on with Thorson and Nash's house that nobody ever talked about. He got trapped in it. And at some point, it started off as a party and fun, and it ends up being, a nightmare and a cage, which is kind of what happened when you got in too deep with Eddie Nash at that point. I think one of the really interesting aspects in the aftermath of the murders is the next morning, the neighbors who heard all these screams around 4 a.m., nobody called the cops because they were used to it with this house. There was always a party going on. And everybody hated these guys, right? I mean, they were a nightmare to live next door to. So nobody called the cops. And eventually, hours later, there's a professional house mover next door. And he hears the moans coming from Susan Launius in the house. And he sees the pit bull dogs running around. The front door's open. Something's not right. But he wasn't the first person in the house. He eventually calls the cops. He wasn't the first person in the house. There had been other people in the house that morning after the murders, and the police were able to determine that. Two of those guys, a guy named Whitey Melvin Hull and Jimmy Vegas, James Adris, and they were friends of Launius who were supposed to show up that morning and drive Ron Launius up to Sacramento for a court date. And they show up, and it is obviously, it's a slaughter. And they just end up leaving. But pretty soon after that, a bunch of other people start showing up at the house. And the reason is they're heroin addicts. They're there to buy heroin. They're customers of the Wonderland gang. And apparently, and I don't know why, but heroin addicts make their buys in the morning, as opposed to other drug addicts, who buy drugs later on in the day. Apparently, heroin addicts tend to make buys in the morning. And so you have these people stopping by the house to buy their junk early in the morning, and they walk in and, they see a crime scene that's worse than the Manson murders. And what do? They don't run away. They don't call the police. They go through the house looking for heroin. And open drawers, disturbing a crime scene, opening drawers, looking, in the closet, looking in desks. And meanwhile, they're surrounded by people whose heads have been caved in, whose bodies have been, beaten beyond recognition. It's really disturbing. And that's the world that these folks were living in, that even after they were horribly tortured to some extent, maimed and mutilated and murdered, is that the most important thing for their customers and their friends were just finding drugs. They didn't even call the police. And then there was another guy named Cherokee, who was a friend of the Wonderland gang, Larry Hirschman, who actually seemed to be a pretty decent dude. I don't know why he was involved with them. But in the crime scene footage that the LAPD shot, you can hear a phone ringing a few times. And that ended up being Cherokee, who was calling, seeing where they were. So this was a really social group. There were their criminal network connections, but they had a lot of friends and parties and people in and out. And it just turned out in the end that, nobody really cared. In a lot of ways, the big picture here, John Holmes gets a lot of the attention because of who he was. But for me, I think really the center of the story is Ron Launius. Eddie Nash is absolutely fascinating, but it's Ron Launius who's really, at the center of this thing. And essentially what Ron did was fuck with the wrong guy. Ron was the head of a really violent and tough, gang of drug dealers and robbers and burglars and fencers who, did anything they could to maintain their addiction, to find and buy heroin and just stay high and party and have fun and maybe make some money along the way. And I think the drugs and the hubris, the power, the fact that all these other criminals were kind of afraid to mess with these guys got to his head. He decided that we're going to take out Nash. And I think initially the idea was to get their antique guns back that they felt Nash had stolen from them, but also to get some cocaine and maybe some cash. What they ended up taking was $1.2 million in jewelry and cash and drugs, which is an enormous amount and a lot more than they bargained for. And I think it got out of control. But the problem for these guys is that they thought they were tough. They thought they were organized. They thought they were special. But, they were dealing. Sorry, my daughter just walked in. You can't hear this. This is.
Oh, no.
What are you doing? She's homesick today. No. I'm on a podcast. Yeah. You can't hear this. Love you. Oh, God. It's really bad timing there, right? I'm so sorry. I was trying to wave her away.
No worries. Yeah. That's great. Yeah.
Eddie Nash was not a small-time drug dealer. He was the real deal. And he had a professional, even though, messed up organization and criminal network. And these guys played for keeps. And Ron Launius thought that he could get away with this. He messed with the wrong guy.
Yeah, well, Eli, this has been another incredible conversation. Thank you so much for spending some time with us here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I love doing this. Thanks so much, you guys.
Yeah, we can't wait to get you back on again. If there's another story that you want to tell us, or if you think that there's more to this one that, we can continue to unpack, then yeah, doors open.
Awesome. I appreciate it. Anytime you guys need anything.